After I dropped my wife off at the airport for her business trip, my 8-year-old son tugged at my sleeve, his voice shaking. "Dad, we cannot go home. I heard Mom planning something bad for us." So we hid. 10 minutes later, I froze when I saw a black utility van pull up to our driveway. Two men stepped out, bypassed my $10,000 custom security system using my private master code, and carried 3 heavy steel canisters into my basement. If you are just starting to watch this story, now take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen under my own roof in the sanctuary I built for my family. I am a man who spent his entire life building an empire, trusting the people closest to me, only to discover that the greatest danger was breathing right beside me in the dark. Sometimes we think we know the people we love, but there are hidden horrors that only come to light when we least expect them. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to my voice today. My name is Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I own a heavy industrial equipment leasing company based in Texas. I am a man who deals in cold, hard facts. I built my fortune from scratch, moving earth and steel, negotiating with cutthroat contractors, and surviving in an industry that eats the weak alive. In my line of work, you do not survive by being naive or overly trusting. You survive by anticipating the worst, reading the invisible signs, and preparing for any betrayal. But absolutely nothing in my 70 years of life could have prepared me for the profound chill that ran down my spine that Tuesday evening. It was supposed to be a completely normal winter night. I had just driven my 38-year-old wife Valerie to the airport terminal. She was heading to Chicago for a week-long commercial real estate seminar. My son Toby was uncharacteristically quiet in the back seat during the entire ride to the airport. I thought he was just sad to see his mother leave. Toby is a quiet boy, deeply observant, the kind of kid who absorbs every single detail around him, but rarely speaks out of turn. He is my blood, and he shares my quiet nature. But the very moment Valerie walked through those sliding glass terminal doors and disappeared into the crowd, and I put the heavy truck into drive, Toby unbuckled his seatbelt. He leaned over the center console and grabbed my right arm. His small, fragile hands were trembling so violently, I could feel the rapid vibrations straight through the thick fabric of my winter coat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated terror I had never witnessed in him before. He whispered the words that would systematically dismantle my entire reality. "Dad, we cannot go home. I heard Mom on the phone earlier. She said the house needs to be empty tonight. She told someone she was planning something bad for us." A younger, softer man might have dismissed those words. A foolish, overly optimistic husband might have laughed it off as an 8-year-old's overactive imagination or a gross misunderstanding of a boring adult conversation. But I am 70 years old. I have spent my life reading between the lines. My instincts are razor-sharp, honed by decades of corporate warfare. Looking down at my son's pale, terrified face, my gut screamed like a warning siren that he was telling the absolute, unfiltered truth. Valerie had been acting undeniably strange for weeks. There were hushed phone calls taken out on the freezing patio late at night. There were sudden, unexplained errands that took hours longer than they should have. I had felt a cold distance growing between us, but I had rationalized it. I had blamed it on our significant age difference, the stress of the holidays, and the predictable, quiet routine of a 10-year marriage. I had let my guard down because I wanted to believe in the illusion of a happy home. I did not bombard Toby with a million panicked questions. I did not raise my voice or show any outward sign of fear. I simply nodded, kept my face completely neutral and calm, and gently squeezed his trembling shoulder. "All right, son," I said softly. "We are not going home tonight." Instead of pulling into the long, beautifully manicured driveway of our sprawling Texas mansion, I drove right past it. I killed the headlights and parked my heavy SUV 2 blocks down the street, carefully hiding the vehicle under the thick, dark canopy of an ancient oak tree. From this strategic vantage point, we had a clear, unobstructed view of our front iron gates and the sweeping driveway. We sat together in the suffocating darkness. The engine was off, and the bitter cold of the November night began to slowly seep through the glass windows. Toby clutched his small school backpack tightly to his chest, his breathing shallow, erratic, and fast. I kept a firm, reassuring hand on his shoulder, keeping him calm while keeping my own escalating fury tightly grounded. We waited in absolute silence. 5 agonizing minutes passed, then 10. I was just about to tell Toby that the coast was clear, that maybe it was just a false alarm, when a vehicle slowly turned onto our quiet, affluent street. It was a black utility van. There were no corporate logos on the side panels. There were no visible license plates that I could make out in the murky street lighting. It crawled down the pavement like a predator, its headlights completely shut off, a dark shadow slipping effortlessly through the wealthy neighborhood. It stopped dead center right in front of my towering wrought iron gates. My chest tightened with a sickening realization. Those gates were secured by a state-of-the-art $10,000 custom security system I had personally overseen the installation of. It required a randomized security fob and a biometric thumbprint scan. It required an emergency, highly encrypted master override code. That master code was a sequence of numbers only 2 people in the entire world possessed, me and Valerie. I watched in absolute, breathless silence as a tall, heavily built man stepped out of the passenger side of the black van. He walked purposefully straight up to the security keypad. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He did not look around nervously. He simply punched in a complex series of numbers with practiced, fluid precision. A second later, the heavy iron gates swung open without a single sound, welcoming the intruders onto my property. My blood ran completely cold. The master code. He had just used my private, deeply guarded master code. The van rolled smoothly into my driveway and parked near the side entrance, the specific door that leads directly down into the sprawling basement. The driver stepped out to join the first man. They were dressed in dark, generic work clothes, wearing thick industrial gloves. They moved with a chilling military efficiency. It was the kind of highly coordinated movement that told my seasoned brain they had thoroughly rehearsed this entire operation. They knew exactly where my exterior security cameras were pointing, expertly keeping their faces angled away from the glowing red lenses, sticking flawlessly to the blind spots I thought only I knew existed. They walked to the back of the utility van and swung open the heavy rear doors. Together, grunting with exertion, they hoisted out 3 large cylindrical steel canisters. Even from 2 blocks away, peering through the darkness, I could tell those canisters were incredibly heavy. The men strained under the immense weight, their breath pluming in the freezing night air, as they carried the imposing metal cylinders toward the basement door. Toby whimpered softly and buried his face deep into my arm. I pulled him close, holding him tight, while my eyes remained fiercely locked on the terrifying scene unfolding in my own driveway. I am not a man who gets scared easily. I have faced down total financial ruin, ruthless lawsuits, and hostile corporate takeovers without blinking an eye. But watching 2 nameless, faceless men carry heavy industrial steel tanks into the literal foundation of the house, where my young child and I were supposed to be sleeping, a profound, icy rage took hold of my very soul. They went inside. The heavy side door clicked shut firmly behind them. For exactly 15 minutes, my sprawling house sat in total, undisturbed darkness. Not a single light switch was flicked on. They were working entirely by the beam of their tactical flashlights, navigating the complex, multi-room layout of my basement with a disturbing familiarity that made my stomach churn with nausea. Someone had meticulously provided them with the architectural floor plans. Someone had given them the ultimate security codes. Someone had explicitly cleared the house for them tonight. And that specific someone was currently sitting comfortably on a commercial airplane, or supposedly sitting on a plane flying high above the clouds to Chicago. I mentally calculated the precise layout of my basement. The large utility room down there housed the central HVAC unit. I had just spent a small fortune completely replacing the entire ventilation system 3 weeks ago, personally making sure it was top of the line and completely integrated into the home's automated smart network. Why on earth would two unauthorized men be carrying heavy steel tanks into a newly renovated utility room in the dead of the night? They were clearly not stealing anything. Common burglars bring empty duffel bags and leave with full ones. These men brought heavy specialized equipment, and they fully intended to leave it behind. Exactly 15 minutes later, the basement door swung open again. The two men stepped back out into the freezing Texas night. They were completely empty-handed. The massive steel canisters had been left somewhere deep inside my home. They moved quickly and silently, locking the heavy door securely behind them, piling back into the dark cabin of the black van, and smoothly reversing out of the long driveway. The iron gates slowly glided shut behind them perfectly, locking back into place as if absolutely nothing had ever happened. The van drove off in the opposite direction, melting seamlessly into the dark shadows of the neighborhood, leaving my beautiful empty house standing quiet and dangerously undisturbed. I sat in the freezing cabin of the SUV, my calloused hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned pure white. My mind was racing, analyzing the variables, dissecting the situation with the cold, ruthless logic that had made me a highly successful millionaire. My wife had looked me in the eye and told me she had a boring real estate seminar. She had left the house. She had somehow inadvertently communicated to my young son that the house needed to be completely empty tonight. And now two cold professionals had just rigged something massive and heavy in my basement. I looked down at Toby. He was looking up at me, his small chest heaving, waiting for me to make it all okay. Waiting for his strong father to protect him from the monsters in the dark. I am not going to call the police. Not yet. If I call the police right now, they will undoubtedly find the canisters. They will write up a standard bureaucratic report, and whoever masterminded this elaborate trap will scatter instantly into the wind. They will hide in the shadows, and I will never know the full, terrifying extent of the truth. I needed to know exactly what kind of deadly trap had been set for me, and more importantly, I needed to hear my wife try to lie her way out of it. I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I checked the digital clock on the screen. Valerie's flight should have landed in Chicago by now. I was going to make a simple, innocent phone call. I was going to listen closely to the tone of her sweet voice, the subtle cadence of her breathing. I was going to let her spin her perfectly crafted, plausible lie, and I was going to use every single word she said to weave the very rope that would eventually hang her. I took a deep, steadying breath, dialed her familiar number, and pressed the phone to my ear, watching my dark, silent house waiting like a loaded gun for me to step inside. I shifted the SUV into drive and eased my foot off the brake. The vehicle rolled forward silently, creeping away from the curb. I did not turn on the headlights until we were 3 blocks down the road, safely out of sight. Toby remained perfectly still in the passenger seat, his small hands clutching the straps of his backpack, his eyes watching the dark streets roll past us. I kept the phone pressed firmly against my ear, listening to the hollow ringtone echoing in the quiet cabin. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. With every passing second, the cold dread in my stomach twisted tighter. Finally, on the 4th ring, the line clicked open. The connection was clear, but the voice on the other end was a carefully constructed performance. "Hello," Valerie murmured. Her voice was thick, heavy with the simulated grogginess of a woman who had just been jolted awake from a deep sleep. She let out a soft, theatrical yawn that set my teeth on edge. "Harrison, honey, is everything all right? Do you have any idea what time it is here?" Her tone was flawless, a perfect blend of spousal affection and mild annoyance. If I had not just watched 2 faceless men infiltrate my home using her private security clearance, I would have believed every single syllable. I forced a warm chuckle, wrapping my voice in the clueless demeanor she expected from her aging husband. "I am sorry for waking you, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone light. "I just wanted to make sure you made it to your hotel safely." You know how I worry about you when you travel alone, especially with this winter storm front moving across the Midwest. How is Chicago treating you?" Valerie sighed, a long sound of exhaustion meant to convey the weariness of a busy professional. "It is absolutely miserable here, Harrison. You would hate it. The wind is howling right off Lake Michigan, and the snow has not stopped falling since I landed. It took my cab driver 2 hours just to navigate through the blizzard and get me to the hotel. I am freezing exhausted, and my seminar starts at 8 in the morning. I ordered some hot tea and crawled under the thickest blanket I could find." Her detailed description of the freezing Illinois weather was delivered with absolute conviction. She was laying down the foundation of an ironclad alibi with the skill of a seasoned grifter. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I listened to the woman I slept next to spin a web of complete fiction. "Well, I am glad you are safe and warm now," I replied, betraying none of the raging storm inside me. "I will let you get back to sleep in a minute, but I had a quick question for you." "What is it?" she asked, the feigned sleepiness slipping just a fraction, replaced by a subtle edge of guarded curiosity. I kept my eyes focused on the dark road ahead, navigating the quiet residential streets as I carefully laid my trap. "It is probably nothing to worry about," I began casually, "but my phone just gave me a strange notification from our home security network. The smart system registered a brief disruption at the front gate and a sensor bypass at the basement door 20 minutes ago. The main alarm did not trigger, so the monitoring company did not dispatch the police, but the system logged that the master code was used to gain entry." I paused, letting the silence hang over the line for a crucial second. "I was just wondering if perhaps you scheduled someone to drop off a delivery or perform some sort of maintenance while I was out. Did you give anyone the master access code before you left for your trip?" The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It only lasted for 3 seconds, but to a man trained to read negotiations and detect deception, that brief hesitation was deafening. It was the sound of a predator quickly recalibrating her strategy, calculating the variables, and formulating an excuse to cover her tracks. When she finally spoke, her voice was bathed in artificial relief and a light, dismissive laugh. "Oh my goodness, Harrison, I forgot," she exclaimed, her tone dripping with manufactured innocence. "I am so sorry, honey. I should have told you before I left. The HVAC guys called me this morning. They said they needed to come by tonight to do an emergency upgrade on the basement ventilation ducts. Something about a recall on the intake valves they installed recently. I knew you had a busy day, and I did not want to bother you with household chores while I was traveling, so I gave them the master code and told them to let themselves in through the side door. I am so sorry for scaring you. They probably just finished the upgrades and left." Her lie was smooth, logical, and delivered without a single tremor of guilt. It was the perfect excuse designed to immediately shut down any further investigation from a trusting husband. A clueless old man would have accepted that explanation without a second thought. A foolish husband would have thanked her for taking care of the house maintenance and wished her a good night. And so that is exactly the role I played. I let out a loud, relieved sigh, forcing my tense facial muscles to relax into a warm smile she could hear through the phone. "Well, that explains it," I said cheerfully. "Thank you for handling that, sweetheart. You know I despise dealing with contractors. I will not keep you awake any longer. Get some sleep, do well at your seminar tomorrow, and call me when you have a free moment." "I love you, Valerie. I love you too, Harrison," she replied softly. Sweet dreams. The phone line went dead, leaving me in total silence. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and placed it into the center console. The digital dashboard clock glowed faintly in the darkened cabin, casting a harsh light over my hands. I sat perfectly still as the sheer horrifying magnitude of her calculated deception washed over me. Her explanation was flawless, except for one fatal flaw that proved her absolute guilt. 3 weeks ago, while Valerie was visiting her sick mother, I had personally overseen the complete replacement of the HVAC system in our house. I had hired a commercial crew from out of state to install an industrial system. I handled the contracts, I paid the invoices in cash, and I supervised their labor. Valerie had absolutely no idea the new system even existed. There were no HVAC technicians dispatched to my home tonight. There was absolutely no emergency maintenance scheduled for our house. There was only a calculated, lethal trap waiting for me in the dark basement of my own home, rigged by two men who had been granted direct access by the woman who had sworn to protect me. And based on what my terrified son had warned me about, she was actively ensuring that death was going to come for me tonight. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and drove away from the quiet shadows of my affluent neighborhood. The heater hummed softly in the dark cabin, but it did nothing to dispel the absolute ice running through my veins. I needed a secure location to think a place where no one would look for a man of my wealth and status. I drove for 40 minutes, deliberately taking narrow back roads and avoiding the major interstate highways where traffic cameras might record my license plate. I needed to disappear entirely to assess the terrifying battlefield my marriage had just become. On the desolate outskirts of the city, sitting in the flickering glow of a broken neon sign, I found a rundown roadside motel. It was exactly the kind of nameless establishment that asked absolutely no questions and demanded no official identification if you crossed the front counter with crisp cash. I left the rumbling engine running and carefully carried Toby inside, holding his small frame tight against my chest. He was completely exhausted, his fragile body heavy with the massive emotional toll of the night. I approached the bulletproof glass and slid $200 bills through the metal slot. The tired clerk handed me a brass key attached to a faded plastic tag without uttering a single word. I carried my sleeping son into the small, dimly lit room. The stagnant air smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap industrial cleaning products. It was a very stark contrast to the pristine luxury of the modern mansion we had just fled. I gently placed Toby on the stiff mattress and pulled the scratchy woolen blanket over his trembling shoulders. He did not stir. The sheer exhaustion of his pure terror had finally pulled him into a deep, highly protective sleep. I stood over him for a long time, quietly watching the steady rise and fall of his small chest. This incredibly brave child of 8 years old had picked up on a sinister undercurrent that my seasoned 70-year-old instincts had somehow missed entirely. I felt a profound, suffocating wave of guilt wash over my entire being. I had willingly brought this woman into our lives. I had given her a beautiful diamond ring, a respected title, and completely unfettered access to the private inner workings of my vast financial empire. I had purposely blinded myself to the truth. I wanted to believe I had truly found a loyal, loving partner for my quiet twilight years. Instead, I had foolishly invited a calculating predator directly into my home, and I had unknowingly placed my only son directly in her dangerous line of sight. But that heavy guilt quickly solidified into a very cold, unbreakable resolve. I was not going to be the clueless old victim in her twisted, greedy narrative. I walked over to the scratched wooden desk in the corner of the room and pulled my lightweight corporate laptop from my dark leather business briefcase with steady hands. The glowing screen illuminated the dark space with a harsh, bright blue light. I connected to my secure, fully encrypted mobile internet hotspot, entirely bypassing the highly unsecure public wireless network of the cheap motel. I desperately needed hard, verifiable data. I needed to meticulously dissect her perfectly rehearsed alibi and expose the rotting foundation buried beneath it. I opened my private web browser and navigated straight to the commercial airline flight tracking database. I knew exactly which specific commercial flight Valerie was supposedly assigned to be on tonight. I had personally booked her expensive first-class airline ticket myself. I had arranged the luxurious accommodations for her weekend real estate seminar 2 weeks ago. I typed her assigned flight number into the main search bar and pressed enter. The loading icon spun for a brief fraction of a second before the flight status populated on my bright screen. I stared at the bold red letters glaring back at me, feeling the remaining fragile fragments of my 10-year marriage shatter into a million jagged pieces. The flight had not been delayed due to weather. It had not been diverted to another city. It had been completely and entirely canceled. According to the official airline system logs, a massive unseasonal winter blizzard had successfully shut down all inbound commercial air traffic to the greater Chicago metropolitan area. The strict cancellation notice had been officially issued and immediately broadcasted to all ticketed passengers exactly 6 full hours ago. Long before I had even backed my heavy truck out of our driveway to take her to the airport terminal, she had already received the notification on her phone. She knew the flight was canceled before she ever placed her matching designer luggage into the spacious trunk of my personal vehicle this evening. She absolutely knew she was not flying anywhere. Yet she had comfortably sat in the passenger seat right next to me, chatting idly about the boring seminar schedule, warmly kissing my cheek at the busy departure curb, and confidently walking through those sliding glass terminal doors with the perfectly poised stride of a woman executing a flawless theatrical performance. And just 20 short minutes ago, she had casually answered her mobile phone, faked a sleepy, extremely convincing yawn, and complained to me directly about the freezing, bitter wind constantly blowing off Lake Michigan while pretending to be resting in bed. She had flawlessly narrated a completely fabricated cab ride through a snowy, frozen city she had never even set foot in tonight. Valerie never actually left the massive state of Texas. She was still here, hiding somewhere in the dark shadows of the sprawling city, actively monitoring the lethal trap she had personally authorized in my secure basement. She had fed me a meticulously rehearsed alibi, specifically designed to keep me completely docile and incredibly unsuspecting as I unknowingly walked blindly into an early violent grave. The sheer terrifying audacity of her bold lie was absolutely staggering to fully comprehend. However, the chilling, inescapable realization of her actual physical proximity was what truly hardened my beating heart into solid ice. She was not 1,000 miles away in another state. She was dangerously close enough to oversee a highly coordinated, illegal intrusion into my heavily secured family home. The rising tension in my chest violently twisted into a heavy, suffocating knot of pure adrenaline. This sinister operation was not a simple crime of passion or a spontaneous, sloppy act of random greed. This was a meticulously calculated military-grade execution, and my beautiful younger wife was the absolute undeniable mastermind. I slowly closed the metal laptop, the glowing screen going completely black, leaving me sitting in the dim yellow glow of the lonely motel street lamp outside the window. I had successfully survived 5 brutal decades of ruthless corporate warfare, relentlessly crushing bitter industry rivals and expertly navigating incredibly hostile corporate takeovers. Now my ultimate, deadliest enemy was the very woman who proudly wore my expensive wedding ring on her left finger. I took a very deep, steadying breath, letting the freezing, undeniable reality settle deeply into my aging bones. The quiet, deadly hunt for the absolute truth had officially begun. The harsh, pale light of dawn crept through the gaps in the thin, dirty motel curtains. I had not slept a single wink. I spent the entire night sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair by the window, silently analyzing every single variable of the absolute nightmare my life had suddenly become. Toby was still sound asleep on the stiff mattress. Looking at his small face, my resolve hardened into a weapon. I needed to understand the full scope of this betrayal. Valerie was the architect of the domestic trap, but an operation of this magnitude required funding and logistical support that she did not possess on her own. She had an accomplice. I needed to test the perimeter of my professional life. If my home was heavily compromised, my corporate empire was likely under attack as well. At 7 in the morning, I stood up and walked into the cramped bathroom, shutting the door quietly behind me. I pulled out my mobile phone and scrolled to the digital contact for Preston Gallagher. Preston was exactly 34 years old, highly intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. I had personally selected him straight out of a top-tier business school a decade ago. I mentored him, shaped his career, and elevated him to the position of Chief Operating Officer. I treated him like the capable eldest son I never had, trusting him with the keys to my corporate kingdom. If anyone knew about irregular movements within my company, it would be Preston. I took a slow breath, smoothing out the cold anger in my voice, and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, sounding relentlessly professional. Harrison. Good morning, Preston said, his voice echoing slightly. You are up early. I coughed, forcing a weak, ragged sound from my dry throat. Preston, I am afraid I have caught a terrible stomach bug, I said, keeping my tone deliberately strained. It hit me in the middle of the night. I am completely out of commission. I will need to stay home and rest for the next few days. I need you to handle the board meetings this week. The concern in Preston's voice was flawlessly executed. Oh, I am so sorry to hear that, Harrison. Please do not worry about a single thing at the office. I have everything under control here. You just focus on getting your strength back. Is Valerie there, taking good care of you? The sheer audacity of the question almost made my hand physically shake. She left for her Chicago real estate seminar yesterday evening, I replied smoothly. It is just me here holding the fort, but I will manage. I just need sleep. Preston made a soft, sympathetic clicking sound with his tongue. That is highly unfortunate timing, Harrison. Listen, if you need soup medication, anything at all, just say the word and I will have it couriered to the house immediately. You have done so much for me over the years. Taking care of you is the least I can do. I smiled a cold, humorless smile at the stained mirror. Thank you, Preston. I appreciate your dedication. As I prepared to end the call, a sudden sharp sound pierced the background audio of the connection. It was a very specific, high-pitched, melodic triple chime. My body went completely rigid. I stopped breathing. It was the highly distinct sound of a microwave finishing its standard cycle, but it was not just any generic appliance beep. That specific melodic sequence belonged to a highly exclusive custom-imported German convection oven. I knew that exact sound with undeniable certainty because I had purchased that specific, ridiculously expensive appliance exactly 5 years ago. I bought it for a luxury downtown penthouse. I owned a modern property I had acquired as a corporate investment. I had not stepped foot inside that pristine penthouse in over 3 years, essentially forgetting about its daily upkeep. There were perhaps 50 of those elite appliances in the entire massive state of Texas, and I owned one of them. Why in the world was my chief operating officer casually making his morning coffee in the kitchen of my vacant real estate property? I kept my breathing steady, suppressing the violent surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. Well, Preston, I must get back to bed, I murmured, projecting a frail weariness I did not feel. Keep the ship sailing straight today. Consider it done, sir, Preston replied confidently. Get some rest. I disconnected the call and opened the private family tracking application on my phone. I had installed the software years ago, linking my phone, Valerie's phone, and the tablet Toby used for his schoolwork. Valerie rarely ever turned off her location services, clearly believing she was far too clever to ever be caught by something so simple. The digital map loaded, tracking the active cellular ping of her mobile device. A glowing red dot appeared on the high-resolution grid. My blood turned to absolute ice. The blinking dot was not positioned anywhere near the commercial airport. It was not moving along a busy highway or sitting in a distant city. It was entirely stationary, sitting squarely in the middle of the downtown financial district. I zoomed in on the precise coordinates. It was pinging directly from the exact zip code, the exact city block, and the exact towering building of my luxury penthouse. The devastating reality crashed down upon me with the brutal force of a freight train. My beautiful wife and my trusted corporate successor were completely united. They were standing together in the kitchen of my own property, listening to the melodic chime of my custom appliance, casually discussing my impending demise over their morning coffee. The dual-front betrayal was staggering. Valerie was expertly handling the domestic execution, ensuring the mansion was primed for a lethal gas leak, manipulating my son, and feeding me rehearsed lies. Meanwhile, Preston was maneuvering the corporate assets, positioning himself to swallow my life's work the moment my accidental death was officially announced to the mourning public. They had weaponized my trust, my wealth, and my declining age against me. They had boldly been flaunting their treacherous affair right under my nose, intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. The sheer arrogance of their meticulous plan was suffocating. I tightly gripped the smooth porcelain edges of the sink until my aging joints painfully throbbed. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror of the cheap motel bathroom. The clueless, trusting old man they thought they were effortlessly manipulating was already completely dead. In his place stood a hardened, ruthless survivor, a man who built an untouchable fortune by viciously eliminating threats and destroying those who dared to cross him. They wanted to steal an empire, but they had severely underestimated the emperor. I slowly turned off the bathroom light, stepping back into the shadows of the room, ready to officially begin my secret war. I would systematically dismantle every aspect of the false reality they had built, tearing down their illusions piece by bloody piece until there was absolutely nothing left remaining. I stepped out of the cramped bathroom and walked over to the sagging bed where Toby was still sound asleep. The first phase of my counterattack required absolute precision, and my primary objective was entirely clear. I needed to secure my son. If my sprawling mansion was rigged as a lethal gas chamber, and my corporate headquarters was infested with venomous traitors, there was nowhere left in the state of Texas where the boy would be safe. I gently shook his shoulder, waking him with a soft whisper. I told him we were going on a surprise trip, an adventure just for the two of us. He rubbed his tired eyes and nodded, completely trusting me. As I reached down to grab his small school backpack from the worn carpet, the zipper caught on the frayed fabric, pulling the main compartment wide open. A thick manila envelope spilled out onto the floor, scattering a few loose papers. I knelt down to gather them, but my hands suddenly froze, hovering over the documents. It was not schoolwork. It was not colorful drawings or permission slips. I stared down at a pristine, officially stamped birth certificate. Right beneath it lay his original Social Security card and his dark blue passport. My breathing stopped. Toby was 8 years old. He had absolutely no reason to carry vital government identification in his daily school bag. Valerie had meticulously packed these irreplaceable documents before she handed him the backpack and hugged him goodbye at the airport terminal. She knew the house was going to become a deadly crime scene tonight. She knew the police, the fire department, and the relentless insurance investigators would soon be swarming the property, sifting through the tragic wreckage of a fatal accident. She had deliberately removed the most critical documents to ensure they would not be destroyed in the impending disaster. She wanted me completely erased from existence, but she desperately needed the boy to survive perfectly intact. Toby was the sole biological heir to the $80 million logistics empire I had spent my entire adult life building from the ground up. Without him, my massive fortune might be tied up in complex corporate probate or diverted to distant relatives. But with Toby alive, well, and fully documented, Valerie would immediately be granted full legal guardianship and total financial control over his vast inheritance. She had packed his backpack for his survival, and she had packed my house for my funeral. I shoved the heavy manila envelope back into the bag, zipped it completely shut, and carried my sleepy son out into the freezing night air. We climbed into the heavy SUV, and I merged onto the desolate northbound interstate, leaving the treacherous city borders far behind us. I pushed the powerful engine to its absolute limit, driving through the pitch-black darkness with a singular burning focus. The grueling journey ahead would take exactly 12 solid hours, crossing wide state lines and vast stretches of empty snow-covered plains. As the endless miles of dark asphalt rolled beneath the heavy tires, my mind drifted back over the decades of back-breaking labor I had endured to build my logistics empire. I had started with a single rusted delivery truck and a mountain of unpaid debt. I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my personal peace to construct a sprawling network of shipping hubs, commercial warehouses, and heavy freight transports. I fought ruthless competitors, survived crippling economic recessions, and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with a fiercely unyielding grip. I had accumulated $80 million through pure, unrelenting grit. I did not build that massive fortune just to hand it over to a pair of parasitic con artists who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable stepping stone. The heater blasted warm air into the quiet cabin, but I felt nothing but a glacial, terrifying clarity. Valerie and Preston thought my wealth made me a soft, comfortable target. They assumed my age had dulled my edge and blinded my vision. They completely failed to realize that the very same ruthlessness that allowed me to conquer the shipping industry was still very much alive inside my chest. I glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the dark highway stretch endlessly behind me, visualizing the precise, methodical destruction I was about to unleash upon them. I would not simply fire Preston or divorce Valerie. I was going to financially obliterate them, strip them of their stolen dignity, and ensure they spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting in a concrete federal prison cell. But to execute a war of that magnitude, I had to ensure my only vulnerability was securely locked away, completely out of their reach. As the pale gray light of the early morning slowly broke across the rugged horizon, we finally crossed the border into the desolate, unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming. The heavy snow crunched under my thick tires as I navigated the winding, treacherous mountain roads leading deep into the isolated territory. My destination was a sprawling, off-the-grid cattle ranch located 50 miles away from the nearest paved highway or cellular tower. The property belonged to my younger sister, Martha. She was a tough, fiercely independent woman who had spent her entire life working the unforgiving land. We had been quietly estranged for over a decade, largely due to a bitter, unspoken disagreement regarding my hasty marriage to Valerie. Martha had taken one look at my beautiful, calculating young bride and immediately pronounced her a poisonous snake. My foolish, stubborn pride had caused me to push my sister away, choosing the comfortable illusion of a happy marriage over her harsh, unforgiving honesty. But despite our long silence, I knew with absolute certainty that Martha was fiercely loyal to her blood. I pulled the mud-covered SUV to a stop in front of her rustic wooden farmhouse, just as the morning sun illuminated the snow-capped peaks. Martha stepped out onto the wide front porch, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, her weathered face breaking into a look of profound shock as she saw me step out of the vehicle. I did not waste time with hollow apologies or pleasantries. I walked straight up the wooden steps, holding Toby firmly by the hand, and looked my sister directly in her sharp, discerning eyes. I told her that I had been a stubborn, blind fool. I told her that she had been absolutely right about Valerie from the very first day. I explained that my life and my company were under a massive, coordinated attack, and that my house was no longer safe for my son. Martha did not ask a single unnecessary question. She did not gloat or demand a lengthy explanation. She simply put down her coffee mug, knelt down to Toby's eye level, and offered him a warm, comforting smile. She told him he was going to help her feed the horses and learn how to survive in the wild country. She stood back up, wrapped her strong arms around my tired shoulders, and whispered that she would protect the boy with her life. I left my son in incredibly safe hands. The drive from my sister's ranch back to the small regional airport was a blur of frozen landscapes and blinding white snow. I abandoned my luxury vehicle in a long-term parking lot and purchased a one-way commercial airline ticket back to Texas using cash and a secondary corporate identification I kept for emergencies. I could not risk using my primary credit cards or anything that would trigger an automated alert on Valerie's shared financial accounts. I needed to remain completely invisible. The flight was long and uncomfortable, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the absolute fire burning inside my chest. Looking out the small oval window at the endless expanse of clouds, I felt the final remnants of my gentle, retiring persona burn away. I was no longer the tired, aging husband who just wanted to play golf and enjoy his twilight years. I was Harrison, the apex predator of the shipping industry, returning to my territory to slaughter the scavengers who had dared to invade my home. When the plane finally touched down on the familiar Texas tarmac, I did not head toward the bustling taxi stand or call a private corporate chauffeur. I walked 3 miles to a busy commercial intersection and flagged down a battered city cab. I instructed the driver to take me to the forgotten industrial district on the far east side of the city. I needed a central command post that existed entirely off the grid. I found it in a decaying single-story motel sandwiched between an abandoned manufacturing plant and a noisy freight train yard. I paid the clerk for a full week in advance, handing over a thick stack of crisp bills, and walked into a room that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap bleach. The faded wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the single fluorescent bulb overhead flickered with a maddening, irregular rhythm. It was a miserable, forgotten place, but it was absolutely perfect for my needs. I dropped my leather briefcase onto the small, scratched wooden table and immediately went to work. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains tightly shut, plunging the cramped room into artificial darkness. I unpacked my laptop, my secure mobile hotspot, and a series of encrypted external hard drives I always carried in my secret compartment. I was building a war room in the shadows, a hidden fortress from which I would systematically dismantle the lives of the 2 people who thought they had outsmarted me. My first priority was to assemble my generals. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had not called in over 3 years. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Warren was a 72-year-old corporate attorney who had navigated my most vicious legal battles for 3 decades. He was a ruthless, cynical man who viewed the entire world as a complex chessboard, and he was fiercely loyal to me. "Warren," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "I am pulling you out of retirement. I need your mind, your absolute discretion, and your complete lack of mercy." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a dry, rasping chuckle. "It is about time you woke up," Harrison Warren replied. "I never liked that smiling snake you married, and I certainly never trusted that slick kid you put in the chief operating officer chair. Tell me who we are destroying today." I gave him a brief, chilling summary of the gas canisters in my basement, the perfectly timed cancellation of the Chicago flight, and the specific microwave chime I had heard from my own downtown penthouse. I heard the sharp scratch of a match over the phone as Warren lit a cigar. "I need you to hire the best private investigation firm in the state," I instructed. "I want round-the-clock surveillance on Valerie and Preston. I want their phones tapped, their emails intercepted, and their financial records pulled apart piece by microscopic piece. I want to know every single breath they take, but they cannot know they are being watched. If they sense even a shadow of our presence, they will trigger that basement trap or flee the country." Warren exhaled a long breath of smoke. "Consider it done, Harrison. I will have eyes on them before the sun sets. We will bleed them dry." With my physical surveillance network actively deploying into the city, I turned my attention to the digital battlefield. I sat down in the creaking vinyl chair and opened my laptop. Preston was a brilliant young executive raised in the modern age of digital technology and cybersecurity. When I handed him the daily operations of my logistics empire, he had insisted on upgrading our entire server infrastructure. He brought in his own team of young, arrogant software engineers to streamline the network, quietly locking me out of the deep administrative levels under the guise of automated corporate security protocols. He sincerely believed he had successfully severed my internal access, rendering me a blind figurehead who only saw the highly sanitized financial reports he manually chose to print and place on my mahogany desk. Preston was very smart, but he lacked the seasoned paranoia of an old man who built his fortune from nothing. Years ago, long before Preston was even hired, I had paid a freelance programmer an exorbitant sum of cash to hardwire a ghost protocol directly into the foundational source code of the company servers. It was an invisible, highly encrypted backdoor access point that did not exist on any official schematic or IT registry. It was a digital skeleton key designed to survive any system upgrade or server migration. I typed in a complex string of commands bypassing the flashy new security firewalls Preston had installed. The screen flashed black for a terrifying second before a raw, unfiltered directory of the company network flooded my display. I was in. I began pulling the raw data, downloading massive files of unedited transaction histories, vendor payouts, and internal communications. I bypassed the polished quarterly summaries and went straight for the bleeding, chaotic heart art of the daily ledgers. It did not take long for the horrifying reality of Preston's corporate sabotage to reveal itself. I found a tangled, deeply buried web of recurring payments directed to a series of recently formed shell companies. Millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of our equipment maintenance budget and funneled into generic corporate entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. They were charging us for phantom repairs, non-existent heavy machinery, and completely fabricated logistical consulting fees. Preston was bleeding my life's work dry, draining the very lifeblood of the entire company while maintaining a perfect facade of record profits. The sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage was breathtaking. I sat alone in the quiet, dim motel room, staring intently at the cascading numbers on my screen. I felt a cold, dark satisfaction wrap tightly around my beating heart. They had finally made a massive, fatal miscalculation, and I was going to meticulously destroy them for it. After securing the undeniable digital evidence against Preston, I knew I had to immediately address the highly immediate physical threat waiting silently in my home, a place I once considered my absolute safest sanctuary. The financial ruin Preston was orchestrating was absolutely devastating, but Valerie was planning to execute a literal cold-blooded murder. I picked up my encrypted mobile phone and contacted a highly specialized private security firm I had kept on corporate retainer for sensitive asset extractions. I requested their absolute top hazardous materials expert, a silent, heavily credentialed former military combat engineer named Vance. I explained the dire situation with pure clinical detachment. I needed an absolute professional to secretly breach my own compromised security system and safely inspect a suspected chemical trap located deep in my basement. Vance quickly agreed to meet me at a heavily obscured, designated staging area exactly 2 miles from my sprawling estate. I left the dirty motel war room securely locked, slipping out into the freezing, unforgiving midnight air. The dark drive to the lonely rendezvous point was tense and completely silent. Vance was already waiting patiently in an unmarked black utility van. He was a massive mountain of a man carrying a heavy tactical case filled with advanced atmospheric sensors and highly specialized industrial diagnostic equipment. I climbed into his passenger seat and we drove toward the affluent, quiet neighborhood I had fled just 2 nights ago. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron gates of my massive estate loomed ominously in the deep shadows. Valerie had confidently told me she had willingly given the master access code to the supposed maintenance crew. I knew the standard security alarm would not trigger if we used that specific bypass, but I could not risk her monitoring the digital system logs from her luxurious hotel room in Chicago. Instead, I directed Vance to a forgotten, overgrown service entrance near the rear perimeter wall, an analog heavy steel door that connected directly to the old wine cellar. It was a hidden manual access point that the modern smart home security system did not actively monitor. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt with my physical brass key, and we slipped silently into the pitch-black basement of my own home. The cold, stagnant air inside the damp subterranean level was incredibly thick and completely silent. Vance immediately powered on his handheld thermal imaging device and advanced atmospheric scanners. The soft green glow of the digital screens illuminated his focused, weathered face as he swept the surrounding darkness. We moved incredibly slowly past the dusty, expensive wine racks and the heavy wooden storage crates, heading directly toward the primary mechanical room, where the massive humming industrial heating and ventilation units were safely housed. I unlocked the heavy steel utility door, and we stepped into the cavernous, echoing mechanical room. My aging eyes immediately locked onto the completely foreign objects, sitting ominously in the center of the cold concrete floor. They were definitely not standard factory-issued residential HVAC ventilation components. 4 heavy unmarked steel cylinders were tightly strapped together and awkwardly wired directly into the main intake valve of the master suite's dedicated climate control system. Thick, industrial-grade rubber hoses connected the unmarked metallic tanks to a highly sophisticated blinking digital manifold. Vance knelt down beside the chilling apparatus, his movements incredibly slow and completely deliberate. He ran his advanced chemical sniffer along the sealed metallic joints of the heavy steel tanks. He did not speak a single word for 5 agonizing, terrifying minutes. He carefully traced the thick, brightly colored electrical wires leading upward and away from the digital manifold, following them up the raw concrete wall until they completely vanished into the overhead ceiling conduit directly beneath my spacious master bedroom. I watched the grim, undeniable realization wash over his stoic face. He finally stood up, his jaw clenched tight, and turned to face me in the dim, focused light of his tactical flashlight. "This is absolutely not heating equipment," Harrison Vance whispered, his voice dangerously low and completely void of emotion. "This is a highly concentrated military-style weapons-grade delivery system." I stared blankly at the heavy steel cylinders, feeling the cold, absolute reality of my young wife's pure malice literally freeze the warm blood in my veins. "What exactly is contained inside those dark, pressurized tanks?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the low, rhythmic hum of his diagnostic equipment. Vance tapped the glowing digital readout on his handheld scanner. "It is a dense, completely odorless, and highly lethal industrial gas," he explained methodically. "If inhaled, it chemically binds directly to your red blood cells, almost instantly suffocating you from the inside out, before you even realize you are breathing it in. But the true horror is the precise delivery mechanism." He pointed his bright flashlight at the complex wiring harness connected tightly to the digital manifold. She did not just hook this up to a simple, predictable countdown timer. These specific wires are illegally spliced directly into the main electrical relay for your primary master bedroom lighting circuit. The exact moment you walk into your dark bedroom and flip the light switch, it acts as a mechanical trigger. The digital manifold is specifically programmed to silently release the entire pressurized payload of all 4 cylinders straight through your personal ventilation ducts. You would be completely dead before you even safely reached your mattress. The sheer meticulous brilliance of her dark, twisted plan was absolutely terrifying to fully comprehend. She had very deliberately bypassed all the active carbon monoxide detectors in the house, physically disabling their internal digital sensors, so no warning alarm would ever sound to wake me up. When the local authorities eventually discovered my lifeless body the next morning, the heavy, incredibly lethal gas would have already dissipated completely and harmlessly into the vast atmosphere of the massive luxury estate. The county medical examiner would undoubtedly classify the sudden tragic death as an accidental carbon monoxide leak caused by a faulty, newly installed industrial heating system. Valerie would play the role of the devastated, grieving widow to absolute, undeniable perfection. She would weep beautifully at my closed casket funeral, immediately collect the massive life insurance payout, and legally inherit my entire $80 million corporate empire alongside Preston. They had planned a completely untraceable, perfectly executed, cold-blooded, and highly premeditated murder right inside the sacred, trusted sanctuary of my own home. I stared at the blinking green light on the lethal digital manifold, fully realizing how incredibly close I had come to dying alone in the dark. My breathing slowed as a profound, dangerous calm washed over my entire body. I instructed Vance to carefully photograph every single inch of the deadly apparatus and document the exact chemical composition of the lethal gas without disturbing the digital trigger. I needed the physical evidence completely intact for my ultimate retaliation. Valerie and Preston truly believed they had successfully orchestrated the perfect, undetectable crime. They had absolutely no idea that the wealthy, trusting husband they were trying to murder was now watching them from the shadows, meticulously preparing to completely destroy their entire existence. I returned to the desolate motel room just as the first pale streaks of dawn began to crack across the eastern sky. Vance had departed into the shadows without a single word, melting away with his tactical equipment and the damning photographic evidence of my impending murder safely secured on an encrypted drive. I locked the flimsy wooden door of my room, engaging the rusty chain, and immediately sat back down at the small, scratched desk. The glowing screen of my laptop was exactly as I had left it, displaying the raw, unfiltered data of my entire corporate empire. I plugged in my secure headset and dialed Warren. My ruthless attorney answered before the first ring even completed. The tone of his voice was sharp and entirely devoid of his usual cynical humor. "Harrison," he began, his breathing heavy, "my forensic accountants have been working through the night, using the backdoor access you provided. What we are finding is not just simple corporate embezzlement. It is a systematic, highly organized demolition of your entire corporate structure." I leaned forward in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, staring at the cascading columns of financial data illuminating the dark room. "Tell me exactly what Preston has been doing," I demanded, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Warren began to lay out the intricate details of the financial slaughter. Over the past 18 months, Preston had leveraged his position as Chief Operating Officer to authorize hundreds of massive, unprecedented expenditures. He had initiated a completely fictitious fleet modernization program. Millions of dollars had been approved for the purchase of new heavy transport trucks, specialized trailers, and advanced logistical tracking software. However, absolutely none of that equipment had ever been delivered to our physical freight yards. Instead, the massive capital allocations were being systematically wired directly into the banking accounts of a dozen obscure holding companies. I opened the corresponding financial ledgers on my screen, following the digital path Warren was describing. I watched the massive sums of money flow out of my legitimate business accounts and vanish into a complex labyrinth of offshore tax havens. Preston had created a sprawling network of dummy corporations. He named them with generic professional-sounding titles that would easily pass a casual internal audit by a trusting employer. He had established companies specializing in industrial supply, commercial vehicle maintenance, and global supply chain consulting. In reality, these corporations were nothing more than empty digital folders designed specifically to swallow my vast fortune. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Preston was not simply skimming profits off the top of a highly lucrative quarter. He was aggressively draining the foundational operating capital of my $80 million empire. He was intentionally driving the massive logistics company toward the very brink of absolute financial insolvency. I stared at a specific invoice for routine warehouse maintenance that totaled over $400,000. I recognized the authorized vendor. It was a company registered to a private address located in the exact same downtown zip code as my vacant luxury penthouse. I relayed this specific detail to Warren over the secure connection. He let out a low, grim sigh. "They are not waiting for you to die to take your money," Harrison Warren explained methodically. "They are actively bleeding the company dry right now. Their ultimate goal is to completely bankrupt the legitimate business the very moment your tragic death is announced to the public. If the company suddenly collapses under a mountain of fabricated debt, immediately following your sudden passing, the corporate board and the federal investigators will naturally assume the sudden financial ruin was caused by the tragic loss of the founding executive. No one will ever suspect that the chief operating officer intentionally sabotaged the entire operation. The cold, undeniable realization of their dual front attack settled heavily into my chest. Valerie and Preston had orchestrated a brilliant synchronized symphony of absolute destruction. Valerie was exclusively managing the physical execution in the dark basement of our sprawling estate. Her role was to ensure my swift, undetectable demise and immediately secure legal guardianship over my young son, thereby capturing control over any remaining personal assets and avoiding messy probate litigation. Meanwhile, Preston was commanding the quiet corporate slaughter from behind his polished mahogany desk. His objective was to hollow out the massive commercial enterprise, transferring the immense liquid wealth into hidden offshore accounts completely controlled by the two of them. They had weaponized every single aspect of my long, successful life against me. They had used my generous trust, my vast resources, and my deep love for my family to construct a flawless trap. I sat back in the creaking chair, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in my tired eyes. I felt a profound, chilling detachment wash over my entire being. The initial shock and the burning betrayal had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a pure, unadulterated desire for absolute vengeance. I was no longer an aging husband or a semi-retired businessman. I was a cornered predator, and I was going to tear their carefully constructed world apart. "Warren," I said, my voice completely steady and terrifyingly clear, "I want you to immediately freeze every single hidden account your forensic team can positively identify. I want you to draft a comprehensive, legally binding corporate injunction that will instantly strip Preston of all his executive authority the moment I give the final signal. I want his personal bank accounts frozen, his assets seized, and his professional reputation completely destroyed. I want to build a cage so incredibly tight that he will never be able to take another breath as a free man." "You have it," Harrison Warren replied, the ruthless anticipation returning to his gravelly voice. "My team is already preparing the necessary legal filings. We will have the digital chains ready to lock around his neck before the banking institutions open for business on Monday morning. But what about your wife? What are we doing about the mastermind who wired your bedroom to become a gas chamber?" I looked away from the glowing screen and stared at the peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel room. Valerie was a completely different kind of monster, and she required a much more personal form of absolute devastation. Preston was driven by pure corporate greed, but Valerie was driven by a dark, sociopathic malice. She had kissed my cheek and smiled warmly while knowing a lethal industrial gas was waiting patiently in my home to suffocate me in my sleep. "Do not worry about Valerie," I told my trusted attorney softly. "I am going to handle her personally. I am going to let her believe she has won. I am going to let her walk right up to the absolute edge of her glorious victory, and then I am going to push her straight into the abyss she dug for me. Just ensure the corporate trap is completely inescapable." I disconnected the call and slowly closed the heavy laptop. I had gathered the undeniable physical evidence and mapped their sprawling financial betrayal. Now the brutal trap was finally set. It was time to flawlessly execute my devastating final masterstroke. The transition from the claustrophobic confines of my decaying motel room to the sterile interior of the tactical surveillance van was seamless. Warren had moved with astonishing speed, deploying his absolute best private investigators to establish a mobile command center before the morning sun had fully crested the city skyline. I sat rigidly in the heavy leather captain chair, bolted to the reinforced floor of the black utility vehicle. The air inside the sealed cabin was cool and smelled sharply of ozone and burning electronic circuits. A bank of high-resolution monitors hummed quietly in front of me, capturing every possible angle of the busy downtown financial district. My target was the towering structure of glass and steel directly across the busy avenue. It was the exact building where my custom luxury penthouse occupied the entire top floor. The highly trained surveillance technician sitting beside me adjusted a series of complex dials on his control board, bringing the main camera feed into absolute razor-sharp focus. I leaned forward, pressing my eyes against the soft rubber cups of the optical viewing port connected to the massive telephoto lens. The powerful optics cut effortlessly through the vast distance and the tinted architectural glass of my own expensive property. The interior of the spacious penthouse was bathed in the warm golden glow of expensive designer lighting. It was a space I had purchased on a whim years ago, a modern architectural marvel, featuring panoramic views of the sprawling Texas metropolis. I had completely forgotten about its sleek existence, but it had clearly become the luxurious private sanctuary for the two people actively plotting my brutal murder. The camera lens tracked smoothly across the vast living room, finally settling on the expansive outdoor balcony. There they stood. Valerie and Preston were silhouetted against the glittering backdrop of the city lights, completely exposed and entirely unaware of my watchful gaze. Valerie was wearing a stunning, flowing silk dress I had personally purchased for her during a lavish vacation to Italy last spring. Preston stood impossibly close to her, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, paid for by the generous executive salary I provided him. They were laughing. The clear, undeniable joy radiating from their expressive faces was absolutely nauseating to witness. Preston casually raised a crystal champagne flute, gently clinking it against the glass Valerie held in her delicate hand. They were drinking a celebratory toast. They were drinking to their brilliant success, to their immense impending wealth, and to my rapidly approaching funeral. A sudden violent wave of pure visceral anger erupted from the very core of my chest. It was not the fleeting, chaotic anger of a jealous husband discovering a common vulgar affair. It was the deep, terrifying oceanic rage of an exhausted 70-year-old man who had given them absolutely everything. I had opened the heavily guarded gates of my life and generously invited them inside. I had placed a priceless diamond ring on Valerie's finger and promised to protect her forever. I had plucked Preston from the crowded ranks of ambitious corporate climbers, mentoring him daily, and handing him the prestigious keys to a logistics empire I had spent 5 brutal decades building from the ground up. I had willingly surrendered my hard-earned peace to ensure their total comfort and ultimate success. In return for my boundless generosity, they had deliberately chosen to strip my legacy bare and literally suffocate me in my sleep. My hands gripped the heavy metal edge of the surveillance console until my knuckles turned completely white. I watched Preston lean down to kiss my beautiful, treacherous wife, feeling the furious pounding of my pulse echoing violently in my ears. I wanted to storm across the street, breach the secure lobby ride, the private elevator up to the top floor, and watch the smug, victorious smiles melt from their deceitful faces as I destroyed their entire world. But I forced myself to remain completely still. I took a very slow, deep breath, commanding my racing heart to dramatically slow its frantic rhythm. I possessed the undeniable advantage of total surprise, and I could not afford to squander it on a brief, reckless moment of emotional satisfaction. As I stared through the powerful lens, watching them slowly retreat back into the warm comfort of the penthouse interior, the analytical, calculating side of my seasoned brain began to assert total dominance over my raw, burning fury. I mentally reviewed the overwhelming mountain of dark evidence I had gathered over the past 48 hours. I thought about the staggering millions of dollars systematically siphoned out of my legitimate company accounts and the incredibly complex web of untraceable offshore holding companies Preston had established in the remote Cayman Islands. I thought about the 4 heavy steel cylinders of military-grade industrial gas currently sitting in the pitch-black basement of my family estate, specifically wired to execute a flawless, untraceable assassination. I slowly lowered my eyes from the optical viewing port, staring blankly at the dark console in front of me. The intricate pieces of this horrifying puzzle simply did not fit cleanly together. If Valerie and Preston were merely a pair of greedy, impatient lovers desperate to be together, they had much easier, infinitely safer avenues to secure my vast wealth. A common, ruthless divorce settlement would have easily netted Valerie tens of millions of dollars without shedding a single drop of blood. She could have simply walked away a tremendously wealthy woman. Preston was already the highly compensated, incredibly powerful chief operating officer of a massive corporate enterprise. He had absolute job security and a clear, guaranteed path to the ultimate chief executive officer position within the next 2 years. He had absolutely no logical reason to risk an extended federal prison sentence for complex corporate embezzlement. The incredibly drastic, highly lethal measures they had chosen to employ indicated a level of sheer desperation that a simple, illicit romantic affair could never possibly justify. You do not quietly rig a residential master bedroom to become a deadly, pressurized gas chamber simply because you want a faster divorce. You do not risk triggering a massive, sweeping federal financial audit by aggressively draining the foundational operating capital of a highly visible, incredibly successful $80 million logistics empire, unless you are actively running from a much more significant, highly immediate threat. I turned to face the quiet surveillance technician sitting beside me in the dark van. I needed him to dig much deeper into the digital shadows surrounding my treacherous chief operating officer. There was a massive, terrifying variable hiding just out of sight, an unseen, incredibly dangerous pressure actively driving Preston and Valerie to orchestrate this magnificent, highly suicidal scheme. They were not just stealing my money to casually fund a luxurious new life together. They were frantically gathering a massive, untraceable fortune because they were desperately terrified of someone else. My entire empire was not just being systematically robbed. It was being rapidly liquidated to pay off a massive, highly dangerous external debt that I knew absolutely nothing about. The scattered pieces of this deadly puzzle demanded another crucial component. I needed answers. Now, I did not have to wait long for the terrifying answers to arrive. The heavy side door of the tactical surveillance van slid open with a harsh metal scrape, letting in a brief gust of freezing night air before slamming shut again. Warren stepped into the dim blue light of the mobile command center. My ruthless 72-year-old corporate attorney did not look like a man who had just secured a decisive legal victory. He looked pale, his face drawn tight, with a mixture of profound disbelief and genuine horror. He clutched a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope against his chest, as if it were a live explosive device. He did not immediately speak. He simply stood there, catching his ragged breath, staring at me with an expression I had never seen on his deeply weathered face during our 3 decades of brutal corporate warfare. It was a look of absolute chilling pity. I pushed away from the glowing surveillance monitors and turned my heavy leather captain chair to face him. "Tell me what you found," I demanded, my voice cutting sharply through the quiet hum of the electronic servers. Warren placed the thick envelope onto the small metal table between us. He broke the red wax seal with his thumb and pulled out a massive stack of official government documents, printed photographs, and densely packed forensic data sheets. "Harrison," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "We pulled every single thread. We bypassed the standard civilian background checks and utilized an elite private intelligence firm that accesses deeply classified federal databases. I asked them to verify every aspect of Valerie and Preston. We were looking for hidden bank accounts or secret communications. We found something infinitely worse." Warren slid a stark black and white photograph across the metal table. It was a mugshot of a woman who looked exactly like my beautiful wife, but the face was younger, harder, and entirely devoid of the polished elegance I had grown to love. The name printed boldly beneath the harsh photograph was not Valerie. It was Elena Rostova. "Your wife is an absolute phantom." Harrison Warren stated, his gravelly voice dropping to a somber whisper. "Valerie does not actually exist. The charming woman you met 10 years ago, the woman with the wholesome small-town upbringing and the chronically ill mother in Texas, is a meticulously crafted fiction. Elena Rostova is a highly trained professional operative. She has a lengthy, buried criminal record involving high-level corporate espionage and complex financial fraud originating overseas. She slipped into this country 15 years ago under a stolen identity. Everything she has ever told you, every memory, every tear she shed over her fabricated family history was a calculated, perfectly executed lie designed to infiltrate your life." I stared at the cold, unfeeling mugshot of the stranger I had been sleeping next to for a decade. The sheer magnitude of the deception knocked the breath from my lungs. My entire marriage, the quiet evenings, the shared laughter, the tender moments of vulnerability had all been a prolonged strategic military operation. I had not fallen in love with a woman. I had been targeted by a predator. Before I could fully process the devastating reality of my fake marriage, Warren slid a second photograph across the metal table. It was a grainy security image of a much younger Preston standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman I knew as Valerie. They were outside a European banking institution, looking incredibly close and intensely focused. And your golden boy Warren continued tapping a thick finger against Preston's printed face. Preston Gallagher is not a brilliant, ambitious business school graduate from a respectable East Coast family. His academic credentials, his glowing letters of recommendation, his entire professional history are all forged documents created by the same illicit syndicate that built Valerie. His real name is Julian Vance. They are not merely recent desperate lovers, Harrison. They are a deeply entrenched, highly experienced team of professional grifters. They have been working together for over a decade. They specifically target aging, extraordinarily wealthy corporate founders who lack massive, complicated families. They isolate the target, infiltrate the inner circle slowly, siphon the commercial assets, and then violently eliminate the primary mark when the financial extraction is finally complete. The disjointed, terrifying pieces of the deadly puzzle rapidly snapped together with crystal clarity. This was why Preston had mysteriously appeared at my corporate headquarters a year after my wedding, presenting a flawless resume and charming his way into my good graces. Valerie had groomed me to accept him. She had subtly planted the idea that I needed a young, dynamic successor to manage my stressful daily operations. She had manipulated my aging fatigue and my desire to spend more time at home to position her accomplice right at the center of my $80 million logistics empire. They had spent years patiently playing their assigned roles, weaving themselves seamlessly into the very fabric of my existence. Valerie played the devoted, loving wife managing my private domestic life, while Preston played the loyal, eager protege controlling my massive corporate wealth. They are executing their standard exit strategy, Warren explained, leaning heavily against the metal wall of the surveillance van. They never intended to divorce you or embezzle a few $1 million and run. That leaves a massive, dangerous paper trail and an angry, powerful billionaire hunting them down. Their signature method is catastrophic closure. They meticulously drain the corporate accounts into untraceable offshore voids, plunging the legitimate business into sudden, insurmountable debt. Then they execute a highly engineered fatal accident. They ensure the wealthy husband tragically dies, leaving the grieving widow to collect the massive life insurance payouts and the remaining personal assets. By the time the federal authorities and the corporate board fully untangle the massive financial ruin, the widow and the chief operating officer have completely vanished into the wind, safely enjoying their stolen empire in a foreign country without extradition treaties. I sat still, listening to the quiet hum of the surveillance monitors. I looked back at the glowing screen showing the live feed of my luxurious downtown penthouse. Valerie and Preston were no longer on the balcony. They were inside, comfortable, finalizing the last remaining details of my impending assassination. They truly believed I was a naive, gullible old fool sleeping in a doomed mansion, waiting blindly for a lethal cloud of industrial gas to end my life. I had spent the last 48 hours feeling a chaotic mixture of deep sorrow, bitter betrayal, and terrifying confusion. But as I stared at the true criminal faces of the monsters who had stolen 10 years of my life, every trace of human weakness vanished from my soul. They had severely underestimated the fundamental nature of the man they had chosen to rob. I did not build my massive empire by being gentle. I built it by destroying anyone who stood in my way. I stood up, adjusting my dark jacket. The hunt was entirely over. Now the execution of my vengeance would begin. I looked at Warren and gave a single firm nod. Our shadow war was officially active. I stood up, adjusting my dark jacket. The hunt was entirely over. Now the execution of my vengeance would begin. I looked at Warren and gave a single firm nod. Our shadow war was officially active. Warren reached deep into his leather briefcase and produced one final heavily redacted folder. He placed it onto the metal table with a heavy thud, his eyes completely devoid of their usual fierce spark. He told me that the financial theft and the lethal gas trap were only the mechanical components of their grand design. The true horror, he warned, was the psychological architecture of the entire operation. I opened the thick folder, my hands moving with a mechanical, detached precision. The very first document was a certified copy of a marriage license officially stamped and issued by a small, obscure municipality in Eastern Europe exactly 14 years ago. I stared at the names printed in bold black ink. Julian Vance and Elena Rostova. They were legally husband and wife. The man I had treated like a surrogate son and the woman who slept in my bed every single night were bound by holy matrimony long before they ever set foot on American soil. My chest tightened as the sheer scale of the long con fully materialized before my eyes. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was an 11-year, highly premeditated siege. Warren laid out the precise timeline pointing to intercepted emails, encrypted bank transfers, and buried immigration records. Exactly 11 years ago, they had selected me from a carefully curated list of high-net-worth targets. I was the perfect mark. I was a wealthy, aging widower who had just lost his first wife to a sudden illness. I was emotionally vulnerable, socially isolated, and sitting on a massive, highly liquid corporate fortune. Julian, using the fabricated identity of Preston Gallagher, made the initial breach. He utilized stolen academic credentials and a manufactured corporate history to maneuver his way into a junior executive role at my company. Once he was safely embedded within my corporate walls, he began feeding my personal schedule, my private habits, and my emotional vulnerabilities directly to his wife. Elena, newly transformed into the charming, innocent Valerie, used that highly classified intelligence to orchestrate our supposed chance encounter at a charity gala I frequently attended. Every single conversation we ever had, every shared interest, every spontaneous burst of laughter was entirely scripted by her hidden husband. She mirrored my deepest desires, transforming herself into the exact woman my grieving heart desperately needed to find. I read through transcripts of their intercepted, encrypted communications. They discussed my daily routines, my financial decisions, and my declining health with the cold, clinical detachment of butchers appraising a slab of meat. But the darkest, most profoundly evil revelation was buried at the very bottom of the heavy stack of documents. It was a series of intercepted text messages exchanged exactly 9 years ago, shortly after our lavish wedding ceremony. I read the glowing words on the printed page, feeling a sickening wave of absolute revulsion wash over my soul. They were actively discussing the urgent need for a permanent biological anchor. My vast corporate empire was heavily protected by complex trusts and an ironclad prenuptial agreement that Valerie had willingly signed to prove her false devotion. If I died unexpectedly during those early years, she would only receive a minor fixed settlement. They needed a foolproof mechanism to legally bypass the strict corporate lawyers and secure the entire $80 million fortune. That mechanism was my beloved son. Toby was not a beautiful surprise or a cherished product of our marital union. He was a deliberate, highly calculated insurance policy. Elena and Julian had actively planned his conception, viewing the child as nothing more than a biological key required to unlock my massive vault. They needed a direct blood heir to guarantee that Valerie would gain total, unquestionable control over the entire estate as his sole surviving guardian. The pure, unadulterated evil required to bring an innocent child into the world solely to facilitate a murder and secure a financial windfall was beyond my comprehension. I sat in the dim, claustrophobic surveillance van, clutching the damning documents with trembling hands. I thought about Toby, his bright, trusting eyes, his quiet bravery, and his absolute innocence. He was currently hiding on a frozen, isolated ranch in Wyoming, completely unaware that his very existence was the cornerstone of a decade-long assassination plot. He was a pawn in their vicious game, a living prop they intended to use and likely discard the moment he was no longer legally necessary. The thought of those two monsters raising my son, shaping his mind with their toxic sociopathic greed, ignited a terrifying volcanic rage within my spirit. I carefully placed the papers back into the manila folder and looked across the small table at Warren. My veteran attorney was watching me closely, quietly, assessing my emotional state. He knew the devastating psychological impact of what I had just read. He knew that the betrayal of a spouse was painful, but the weaponization of a child was an entirely different level of psychological warfare. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or slam my fists against the metal walls. The time for raw, unchecked emotion had completely passed. I was now operating with the lethal, freezing clarity of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Warren. I said, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any hesitation. We are going to accelerate the timeline. I do not want to wait for them to make their final move. I am going to draw them out into the open, completely away from my home and away from my corporate headquarters. I want to dictate the exact terms of the final battlefield. Warren nodded slowly, pulling a fresh legal pad from his briefcase. Tell me exactly what you need, Harrison. We have the federal evidence, we have the frozen offshore accounts, and we have the physical proof of the chemical trap. We can completely ruin them with a single phone call to the federal authorities. I shook my head firmly. A simple arrest is far too merciful for what they have done. They spent 10 years methodically stealing my life, my trust, and my dignity. They reduced my son to a mere financial instrument. If we simply hand them over to the police, they will hire expensive defense attorneys and spin a web of lies to minimize their sentences. I want them to fully understand the absolute magnitude of their failure. I want them to look me directly in the eyes and realize that the clueless, aging billionaire they targeted has systematically dismantled their entire universe. I want to watch their arrogant, deceitful faces crumble into pure, unadulterated terror before the authorities ever put handcuffs on their wrists. I instructed Warren to arrange a private meeting at my secure warehouse. They would walk through the doors expecting a defenseless old man begging for comfort. Instead, they would find the absolute inescapable end of their reign of terror. I stood up to leave the mobile surveillance van, my mind already running through the precise logistical requirements for the impending warehouse confrontation. But Warren suddenly held up his hand. The seasoned attorney was not quite finished. He reached into the very bottom of his battered leather briefcase and slowly pulled out a single heavily reinforced manila envelope with a bright red legal seal. I thought we had completely uncovered the absolute depths of their depravity, Harrison Warren murmured, his gravelly voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. But my forensic financial team just flagged an incredibly massive external anomaly that completely bypassed your standard corporate ledgers. He handed me the thick envelope. I opened the flap and pulled out a pristine, multi-page contractual document bearing the distinct embossed logo of a premier international insurance conglomerate. I stared at the bold print on the cover page, feeling a sudden, chilling drop in the ambient temperature of the cramped van. It was a comprehensive, highly specialized executive life insurance policy. It was entirely in my name, but I had absolutely no memory of ever initiating such a monumental agreement. I flipped to the primary summary page, my eyes scanning the heavily structured legal text, and the final horrifying piece of their murderous puzzle violently snapped into place. 3 months ago, precisely during the exact same time frame, when the supposed maintenance crew had gained unrestricted access to my basement, this massive policy had been quietly activated. The principal payout was a staggering $20 million. But the true, terrifying genius of the fraudulent document was buried deep within the complex rider clauses. The policy included a highly specific double indemnity provision that would instantly trigger an immediate uncontested payout strictly in the event of a sudden, unforeseen accidental death occurring within the primary residence. It was a completely bulletproof financial mechanism designed to instantly liquidate upon my carefully orchestrated demise. I turned to the final signature page, staring intensely at the bottom right corner. My signature was executed with absolute flawless precision. The sweeping loops and sharp angles were a perfect, indistinguishable forgery. Julian, utilizing his deeply entrenched access as my trusted chief operating officer, had effortlessly bypassed the rigorous corporate authentication protocols. He had used my digital executive credentials to silently authenticate the massive policy without triggering a single internal alert. And the sole uncontested beneficiary listed on the fraudulent document was, of course, Valerie. She was positioned to legally absorb $20 million of untraceable liquid capital the very instant the county medical examiner mistakenly ruled my death a tragic carbon monoxide accident. The sheer breathtaking scale of their absolute ruthlessness washed over me in a freezing, suffocating wave. They were not merely attempting to steal a sizable portion of my hard-earned corporate wealth. They had constructed a flawless, multi-layered machine designed to completely devour every single aspect of my existence. I sat silently in the dim blue light of the surveillance monitors, mentally tracing the terrifying trajectory of their master plan. First, Julian would use his extensive executive access to quietly bleed the foundational operating capital of my logistics empire into a vast, untraceable network of offshore shell corporations. Second, Valerie would execute the physical assassination utilizing the hidden industrial gas cylinders to silently suffocate me in my sleep. Third, she would play the devastated widow, instantly collecting the $20 million accidental death payout, while entirely avoiding the lengthy, complicated corporate probate process. And finally, they would snatch my innocent, trusting son. They would use Toby as the ultimate biological anchor, legally binding themselves to whatever remaining assets the corporate lawyers managed to salvage from the impending bankruptcy. Once the dust completely settled, and the federal investigators closed the accidental death file, Valerie, Julian, and my captive son would vanish into the international wind, immensely wealthy and entirely untouchable. I stared at the forged signature, feeling the last remaining shreds of my inherent humanity burn away, leaving behind nothing but cold, weaponized steel. They had genuinely believed I was just another aging, gullible Mark, a foolish old man, blinded by a beautiful young wife, and completely dependent on a charismatic corporate protégé. They had meticulously calculated every single variable, every financial transaction, and every lethal chemical reaction. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They had fundamentally failed to understand the primal, violent nature of the apex predator they had chosen to hunt. I did not build an $80 million empire by surrendering to aggressive competitors. I built it by absolutely crushing them into dust. I handed the insurance documents back to Warren, my hands completely steady and my heart beating with a slow, terrifying rhythm. I looked back at the glowing surveillance monitors, watching the dark windows of my luxurious penthouse. The intricate 10-year illusion was completely shattered. I knew exactly who they were. I knew exactly how they operated, and I knew exactly how to dismantle their entire criminal universe. I told Warren to finalize the preparations at the secure warehouse. It was time to invite the monsters into the light. I needed to ensure that my final retribution was as absolute and unrelenting as the horrific suffering they had planned for me. The $20 million policy was the ultimate testament to their insatiable, grotesque greed, proving unequivocally that they viewed my violent death as just a highly lucrative corporate acquisition. I instructed Warren to place the fraudulent insurance contract back into his leather briefcase and seal it away. We would not cancel the massive policy immediately. Instead, I wanted my legal team to secretly hijack the digital beneficiary routing codes, silently redirecting the eventual payout into an impenetrable corporate trust, exclusively controlled by my loyal attorneys for the sole benefit of my son. Let them blindly believe their golden parachute was still firmly intact. Let them walk confidently into my warehouse, fully expecting to celebrate their grand, magnificent triumph over a weak, defenseless old man. As the surveillance van slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering high-rise penthouse far behind in the freezing darkness, I mentally reviewed every single detail of the impending confrontation. The heavy steel doors of the industrial warehouse would close tightly behind them instantly, severing their connection to the outside world. They would step into the cold, cavernous space completely unaware that their carefully constructed decade-long illusion had been entirely obliterated. I would stand before them not as a broken, betrayed husband or a defeated, bleeding executive, but as the absolute architect of their imminent destruction. I would present them with the undeniable evidence of their forged identities, their stolen millions, their lethal gas canisters, and their fraudulent $20 million insurance claim. I would strip away every single layer of their deceit until they were left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating reality of their ultimate failure. The predator had finally become the prey, and I was going to meticulously, systematically, dismantle their entire lives with the exact same cold, calculating precision they had so eagerly reserved for mine. The final trap was now perfectly primed, completely inescapable, and absolutely ready to be violently sprung upon them both. I returned to the absolute silence of my decaying motel room and sat heavily on the edge of the stiff mattress. The flickering neon light from the parking lot outside cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked plaster walls, illuminating the absolute squalor of my temporary fortress. I remained sitting in the suffocating darkness for hours, wrestling deeply with the terrifying phantom of my 10-year fake life. I closed my tired eyes and forced my mind to meticulously replay an entire decade of manufactured memories, picking apart every single lie they had so effortlessly fed me. I vividly pictured Valerie walking elegantly down the grand staircase of our massive estate on our wedding day, her bright, innocent smile radiating a warmth I now knew was completely synthetic. I remembered the incredibly proud, foolish moment I first introduced Julian to the corporate board of directors, genuinely believing I was safely handing the heavy mantle of my life's legacy to a worthy, honorable son. Every single tender embrace we shared, every whispered word of manufactured comfort during my moments of intense executive stress, every joyous, picturesque holiday morning we spent opening expensive gifts around the towering stone fireplace. It had all been a flawlessly executed, deeply sinister, theatrical performance. They had lived intimately inside my home, eating meals at my personal table and sleeping peacefully under my protective roof while secretly, methodically measuring my literal worth by the pound. I thought about the countless times Elena had warmly embraced me, resting her head against my chest, listening to the very heartbeat she was actively plotting to silence forever. They had fundamentally weaponized my inherent human decency, transforming my natural desire for a loving family into the exact instrument of my own impending destruction. The sheer breathtaking scale of their unadulterated malice was genuinely impossible to truly comprehend. Yet as I sat completely alone in that miserable, forgotten room, a profound and terrifying transformation took place deep within my aching chest. I did not shed a single pathetic tear for the beautiful, devoted wife who never truly existed. I did not mourn the brilliant, ambitious protégé who had merely been a parasitic, deadly illusion. The soft, forgiving, retiring old man who simply wanted to peacefully play golf and quietly fade into a comfortable twilight, permanently ceased to breathe. In his incredibly weak place, the ruthless, bloodthirsty, calculating tycoon I had been in my violent, unforgiving youth fully resurrected himself. Decades ago, I had built my massive, sprawling logistics empire by systematically crushing vicious commercial competitors, aggressively repelling hostile corporate takeovers, and entirely breaking corrupt, greedy union bosses. I had intentionally buried my inherent mercy beneath a massive, unyielding mountain of aggressive ambition, because it was the absolute only way to survive the brutal, merciless realities of global commerce. I had foolishly, naively allowed that hardened protective armor to slowly rust over the past 10 tranquil years, dangerously lulled into a completely false sense of security by a pair of smiling sociopathic predators. Now that thick, heavy armor snapped violently back into place, firmly sealing my vulnerable heart behind an impenetrable, towering wall of freezing absolute logic. Every single shred of misplaced, foolish paternal affection I had ever mistakenly harbored for Julian, completely evaporated into the damp, stale air. Every lingering, pathetic ounce of husbandly devotion I previously felt for Elena burned entirely away into white-hot, useless ash. I felt a sudden powerful surge of pure, unfiltered adrenaline coursing violently through my aging veins, completely banishing the heavy exhaustion that had previously plagued my tired mind. I was absolutely no longer a blind, helpless victim, patiently waiting in the dark to be slaughtered in his sleep. I was a man entirely reborn in the burning fires of absolute betrayal, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire stolen universe. I was now the absolute terrifying architect of their ultimate impending ruin. I immediately reached for my encrypted laptop and quickly initiated a highly secure, completely untraceable video conference directly with Warren. He answered almost instantly, looking visibly exhausted, but deeply intensely focused on the digital screen. I instructed him to completely bypass the local municipal law enforcement authorities. We were permanently elevating this massive complex betrayal to the highest, most severe echelons of absolute federal jurisdiction. I strictly ordered Warren to immediately transmit the entire comprehensive forensic financial dossier directly to my most trusted, high-ranking personal contacts, permanently stationed within the powerful Securities and Exchange Commission and the formidable Federal Bureau of Investigation. We willingly provided the eager federal agents with the exact highly classified routing numbers for Julian's deeply hidden offshore shell corporations, the meticulously documented, undeniable proof of the massive corporate embezzlement, and the absolute devastating photographic evidence exposing their true buried criminal identities. We deliberately handed the United States federal government the precise, highly detailed digital blueprints of a massive multi-million-dollar international money laundering syndicate audaciously operating directly out of my own corporate headquarters. I personally aggressively authorized the immediate catastrophic freezing of every single legitimate corporate asset illegally connected to Julian, effectively trapping him entirely inside a burning, collapsing financial building with absolutely no available physical exits. I explicitly demanded that the specialized financial strike teams immediately seize every single hidden ledger, ensuring that neither Julian nor Elena could ever access a single stolen penny to fund their desperate, inevitable legal defense. I was absolutely determined to leave them entirely destitute and completely defenseless. I desperately wanted the heavily armed federal agents to quietly, efficiently encircle their illicit, sprawling banking network long before the sun even began to rise over the distant eastern seaboard. I wanted the absolute, full, crushing, inescapable weight of the entire United States federal government violently pressing down on their deceitful, treacherous throats. Warren confidently confirmed that the elite federal strike teams were already mobilizing, silently locking down the intricate digital perimeters of our massive trap. The corporate snare was completely unavoidable, but I still needed to heavily manage the highly volatile physical confrontation. I required Julian and Elena to walk willingly into my private warehouse, completely isolated from their luxurious penthouse and entirely cut off from their carefully crafted escape routes. I needed them to stand before me and answer for their decade of absolute, unadulterated evil. I closed the heavy laptop, the metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet, desolate room. I stood up and walked toward the small, dirty bathroom mirror. I stared deeply into my own reflection, searching for any remaining trace of the foolish, trusting husband they thought they were murdering. I found absolutely nothing but a pair of cold, dead eyes staring back. I splashed freezing water onto my face, smoothed the collar of my dark jacket, and checked my encrypted phone one final time. The trap was fully armed, the federal agents were waiting in the shadows, and my vengeance was completely absolute. I unlocked the flimsy wooden door of the motel room and stepped out into the biting, unforgiving morning air. It was finally time to reclaim my stolen life and firmly drag both of those treacherous monsters, kicking and screaming, directly into the blistering, completely inescapable light of my absolute justice. The morning sun broke across the glittering skyline of the financial district as I stepped out of the unmarked tactical van. I did not head toward the desolate warehouse just yet. First, I needed to completely sever the financial arteries that fed their parasitic existence. I walked through the towering glass doors of my own corporate headquarters alongside Warren and a discreet team of highly trained federal agents. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the massive lobby was entirely empty, echoing with the sharp, deliberate sound of our collective footsteps on the polished marble floor. I swiped my foundational founder access card, a secure master key that Preston had foolishly assumed he had digitally overridden months ago. The heavy security gates parted instantly with a soft electronic chime. We rode the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, stepping into the cavernous, glass-walled boardroom that proudly served as the beating heart of my $80 million logistics empire. Valerie and Preston were likely waking up in my stolen luxury penthouse right now, sipping incredibly expensive coffee and confidently believing I was still resting peacefully back at the sprawling estate, blissfully unaware of the deadly gas canisters waiting patiently in my basement. They truly thought they controlled the entire board, the bank accounts, and my ultimate fate. They were profoundly, fatally mistaken. I took my customary seat at the absolute head of the long, polished mahogany table. Warren sat directly to my right, rapidly unpacking his heavy leather briefcase, while the senior federal investigators quickly positioned their secure laptops around the perimeter of the room. I immediately summoned my loyal chief of cybersecurity, a quiet, brilliant software engineer named David, whom I had secretly retained specifically for this exact critical moment. I gave David a single firm nod of approval. The boardroom blitz began with breathtaking surgical precision. David typed a rapid series of complex commands into his terminal, completely bypassing the flashy, incredibly expensive firewalls Preston had proudly installed to isolate me from my own creation. In a matter of seconds, the massive digital screens lining the boardroom walls illuminated with the live, undeniable flow of Preston's illicit financial network. I watched the blinking cursors trace the massive, stolen millions of dollars he had systematically siphoned from our vital equipment, maintenance budgets directly into his untraceable offshore tax havens. It was finally time to permanently close the vault. I authorized David to initiate the absolute administrative override protocol. With one decisive, heavy keystroke, every single piece of executive access Preston held was instantly and permanently revoked. His corporate email was immediately locked down. His digital signature authorization was completely erased from the internal registry. The physical security badges for his plush corner office, his private parking garage, and the downtown luxury penthouse were simultaneously entirely deactivated. He was officially a digital ghost within the very company he had so arrogantly tried to conquer. But quietly locking him out of the massive physical building was only the very beginning of his absolute punishment. I turned my undivided attention to the focused federal agents sitting directly across the polished table. They had already seamlessly synchronized their secure governmental networks with our deep internal financial ledgers. I deliberately provided them with the exact routing numbers and the hidden administrative digital keys for every single shell corporation Preston had meticulously constructed in Delaware and the beautiful sunny Cayman Islands. I watched the grim, genuine satisfaction spreading across Warren's weathered face as the senior federal agent made the crucial, highly coordinated phone calls to the powerful international banking authorities. Within 20 agonizingly short minutes, a cascading, unstoppable wave of global asset freezes violently swept across their entire massive stolen fortune. The illicit accounts were not simply paused, pending a routine review. They were completely and permanently seized by the United States federal government under the strict, unforgiving statutes of international money laundering and wire fraud. Every single dollar they had meticulously stolen over the past 18 months was instantly ripped from their greedy, trembling hands. They were left completely destitute, entirely stripped of the vast financial resources they desperately needed to flee the country or hire highly competent legal defense. The massive $80 million empire they had so confidently planned to steal had suddenly transformed into an impenetrable, suffocating, unforgiving steel cage. With the catastrophic corporate bleeding completely halted, I focused my intense rage on the final, most twisted element of their grand design. The $20 million executive life insurance policy that Valerie enthusiastically planned to collect upon my carefully orchestrated demise. I handed the forged contractual documents directly to the lead federal investigator. I explained the precise, horrifying mechanics of the lethal gas trap, waiting patiently in my basement, and how the specific double indemnity clause was brilliantly designed to vastly reward my brutal murder. The federal agents rigorously documented the blatant forgery, establishing a clear, undeniable, and highly profitable motive for the premeditated assassination attempt. We purposefully did not cancel the lucrative policy. Instead, working closely alongside the federal authorities and the top corporate insurance executives, we secretly amended the ultimate beneficiary routing codes deep within the system. If they ever attempted to trigger the massive payout, the stolen funds would instantly divert into a deeply secured federal holding trust, providing the final irrefutable evidence of their deadly conspiracy. Valerie would never see a single dime of the bloody money she had so patiently waited an entire decade to happily collect. The physical sun was now shining brightly through the expansive boardroom windows, casting long, triumphant shadows across the sleek mahogany table. The financial slaughter was absolute and completely irreversible. In less than 2 fleeting hours, I had single-handedly dismantled a dangerous decade-long criminal conspiracy and successfully reclaimed total, unquestionable control over my entire life's work. Preston and Valerie were currently waking up as impoverished, highly wanted felons completely trapped inside a bustling city they could no longer freely navigate. But they did not know it yet. They still foolishly believed they were the brilliant, untouchable masters of my universe. I sincerely thanked the federal agents for their incredibly swift, decisive action, and instructed them to remain entirely out of sight for just a few more hours. I deeply wanted the profound, crushing realization of their absolute failure to hit them directly from my own unyielding hands. I turned to Warren and told him it was finally time to initiate the ultimate phase of our defensive operation. We quickly left the secure boardroom and headed straight down to the waiting tactical van. We were driving directly to the private, highly isolated industrial warehouse located on the bleak, unforgiving edge of the city. I calmly pulled out my secure, encrypted mobile phone and slowly drafted a highly urgent, carefully worded text message to Preston, demanding an immediate, incredibly discreet meeting at the warehouse to discuss a sudden, massive corporate emergency. I knew his arrogant, intensely greedy nature would never simply allow him to ignore a potential massive threat to his stolen fortune. The brutal trap was now perfectly set, the sprawling corporate empire was completely frozen, and the final devastating reckoning was now entirely unavoidable. I sat quietly in the back of the moving surveillance van, watching the city streets blur past the tinted windows. My initial plan to summon Julian to the remote industrial warehouse was sound, but it lacked the immediate visceral terror I truly wanted to inflict. I needed them completely off balance, stripped of their arrogant composure, and forced into a frantic, reckless panic. I needed them to blindly rush into the very center of their own deadly web. I deleted the drafted corporate message I had prepared for Julian and opened my secure text thread with the woman who still legally claimed to be my loving wife. I stared at the blank digital screen for a long moment, my thumbs hovering steadily over the illuminated keyboard. I carefully typed out a single beautifully simple message designed to absolutely shatter her meticulously crafted illusion. I wrote, "Honey, I am feeling much better this morning. I am going down into the basement to check the new heating system. It smells a little funny down here." I hit send, watching the small delivery notification appear on the glowing screen. Then, with a profound sense of dark satisfaction, I immediately powered down the encrypted device, completely severing my connection to the outside world. The digital trap was successfully sprung. I leaned back against the heavy leather seat and allowed myself to vividly imagine the sheer, unadulterated chaos erupting inside my luxurious downtown penthouse at this very second. Valerie and Julian were likely enjoying a quiet, celebratory breakfast, basking in the warm glow of their impending victory. When her phone chimed with that specific message, the blood would instantly drain from her deceitful face. She would stare at the screen in absolute horror, her sociopathic mind racing to comprehend the catastrophic implications of my simple words. If I went down into the dark basement and discovered those 4 unmarked steel cylinders of military-grade gas before I touched the light switch, their entire 10-year conspiracy would be instantly exposed. I would call the local authorities, the federal investigators would descend upon the estate, and they would be aggressively hunted down as desperate fleeing fugitives. Conversely, if I simply walked into the primary mechanical room and blindly flipped the electrical switch triggering the deadly chemical payload, the situation was equally disastrous for them. They were safely miles away in the city center. They needed to be physically present at the sprawling estate to properly control the narrative, to carefully stage the tragic accident, and to immediately secure the massive property before the emergency responders arrived. My sudden, unscripted detour into the subterranean level completely destroyed their perfect, synchronized timeline. They were suddenly trapped in a terrifying, impossible dilemma. They could not simply call me back to stop me because my phone was completely dead. They could not alert the estate security team without drawing highly suspicious attention to the lethal apparatus hidden below. Their only viable option was to physically rush back to the mansion in a state of absolute blind panic. They had to intercept me before I found the rigged manifold, or they had to frantically manage the toxic aftermath of my premature death. I instructed the driver of the tactical van to immediately change our route. We were no longer heading toward the isolated industrial warehouse on the edge of the city. We were going directly back to my home. I wanted to be perfectly positioned inside the secure walls of my own territory when the 2 panicked predators desperately arrived to claim their prize. The drive through the awakening suburban streets was tense and incredibly silent. I mentally reviewed the layout of my massive property, calculating the exact trajectory they would take upon breaching the front gates. They would not bother with the formal sweeping driveway or the grand front entrance. They would head straight for the hidden analog service door near the overgrown rear perimeter wall, the exact same compromised access point Vance and I had utilized just hours ago. We arrived at the quiet estate, slipping through the heavy iron gates without triggering a single perimeter alarm. I directed my private security team to discreetly position their unmarked vehicles deep within the dense manicured foliage surrounding the eastern edge of the expansive property. I left the mobile command center and walked briskly across the dew-covered lawn, breathing in the crisp, freezing morning air. I bypassed the main house entirely and moved directly toward the detached, fortified security pavilion that housed the central nervous system of my smart home. The heavy steel door locked securely behind me, plunging me into a dark, climate-controlled room filled with a massive wall of high-resolution surveillance monitors. I sat down in the central command chair, surrounded by the glowing silent screens displaying every single angle of my sprawling estate. I had complete, undisputed visual control over my entire domain. I accessed the specific cameras covering the dark basement corridors and the primary mechanical room. The 4 deadly steel cylinders sat exactly where Vance had left them, a silent, menacing monument to their breathtaking greed. I watched the blinking green light of the digital manifold, waiting patiently for the frantic arrival of the 2 monsters who had built it. The wait lasted 42 minutes. Suddenly, a sleek, dark luxury sedan violently swerved off the quiet residential street, its heavy tires tearing aggressively into the manicured grass near the hidden rear service entrance. The vehicle came to a harsh, sliding halt, completely ignoring the paved driveway. The passenger door flew open before the powerful engine even fully stopped. Valerie stumbled out into the freezing morning air. She was still wearing the expensive, flowing silk dress from the penthouse balcony, but her polished, elegant demeanor was entirely gone. Her hair was messy, her movements were frantic, and her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Julian scrambled out his sharp suit, looking rumpled in the damp brush. He slammed the heavy car door and rushed toward the rear perimeter wall, roughly grabbing Valerie by her delicate arm as they sprinted desperately toward the analog service door. They looked exactly like trapped, panicked animals blindly running straight into an open snare. Julian fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them. Valerie cursed at him, a harsh, vicious sound that echoed sharply through the sensitive exterior microphones. She shoved him aside and snatched the keys from the ground, her perfectly manicured fingers desperately working the heavy deadbolt. The steel door finally groaned open, and they plunged recklessly into the pitch-black darkness of the subterranean wine cellar. They did not even bother to quietly close the door behind them. They were entirely consumed by the blinding, overwhelming fear of losing their massive stolen fortune. I slowly leaned forward in my command chair, my eyes locked intensely onto the glowing monitor, displaying the long, narrow basement corridor. I reached out and rested my hand firmly over the primary estate lockdown control panel. The ultimate climax of their 10-year deceitful performance was about to begin, and I held the absolute unquestionable power to permanently drop the heavy final curtain. I watched the glowing security monitor as they frantically sprinted down the narrow basement corridor toward the primary mechanical room. They were fully expecting to find the heavy steel door tightly closed, the expensive ventilation system intentionally disabled, and the deadly invisible gas silently filling the subterranean levels of my home. I stood up from the command chair inside the fortified security pavilion and walked calmly through the hidden interior passageway that connected directly to my private executive study. I had specifically chosen this grand room for our final, highly anticipated reunion. It was the exact space where Preston and I had celebrated our most lucrative corporate victories, and where Valerie had poured me countless glasses of aged scotch while softly whispering her poisonous, fabricated affections. I left the thick mahogany study door wide open. I sat down heavily in my favorite wingback leather armchair, deliberately clipped the end off a premium imported cigar, and struck a long wooden match. The rich, heavy smoke billowed upward toward the high vaulted ceiling. The room was completely dark, save for the faint ambient moonlight filtering softly through the tall windows. Standing completely motionless in the deep shadows surrounding my chair were 4 heavily armed federal agents, their dark tactical gear absorbing the minimal light. We listened intently to the frantic echoing sounds of their rapid footsteps pounding up the grand marble staircase. They had found the basement entirely empty. The steel gas cylinders were safely disconnected, the digital manifold was completely powered down, and my expected corpse was entirely missing. Pure, unadulterated panic drove them violently upward, desperately searching the primary residence for any physical sign of my continued existence. The heavy oak doors of the study burst violently open, crashing loudly against the interior walls. Valerie stumbled recklessly into the room, her chest heaving, her wide eyes darting frantically through the thick, oppressive darkness. Preston was right behind her, tightly clutching a heavy brass flashlight like a desperate improvised weapon. They stopped dead in their tracks the very moment the sharp, unmistakable scent of burning tobacco hit their panicked lungs. Preston desperately reached for the brass wall switch. The grand crystal chandelier instantly flooded the expansive room with blinding, pristine light. I sat perfectly still, casually taking a slow, deep draw from my cigar. The thick gray smoke curled elegantly around my face as I looked directly at the 2 terrified monsters standing completely frozen on my expensive Persian rug. Valerie dropped her designer purse. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. Preston took a slow, hesitant step backward, his wide eyes frantically registering the 4 silent, heavily armed federal agents stepping forward from the dark corners of the room. The absolute silence in the study was entirely deafening. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I simply looked at them with the cold, detached curiosity of a professional executioner casually appraising the condemned. "Good morning, Julian," I said, my voice incredibly smooth, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any human emotion. Or should I address you by your actual legally documented given name? Preston Gallagher. The heavy brass flashlight slipped loosely from his trembling fingers, crashing loudly onto the polished floor. Valerie let out a choked, pathetic gasp, raising her trembling hands to her pale face as the crushing, inescapable reality of their situation finally pulverized her arrogant mind. I gestured toward the armed federal agents standing at the room's perimeter. They spent the last 3 hours reviewing a highly detailed collection of buried international documents. We read about your quiet civil wedding ceremony in Eastern Europe exactly 14 years ago. Elena Rostova and Preston Gallagher. An inspiring tale of matrimonial devotion. Valerie fell to her knees, her expensive silk dress pooling around her on the floor. Harrison, she sobbed, her voice a desperate whine. Please, you have to listen. It is a mistake. We love you. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. Do not ever speak the sacred word love to me again, Elena. I know absolutely everything. I know about the 10 years of stolen offshore capital carefully and systematically funneled through your elaborate corporate shell network. I know about the highly specialized $20 million executive life insurance policy you fraudulently activated exactly 3 months ago using my flawlessly forged digital signature. And I definitively know about the 4 unmarked steel cylinders of military-grade gas currently sitting disconnected in my mechanical room. Preston stood completely paralyzed, his jaw working uselessly as he desperately searched for a single viable lie to magically save his miserable, pathetic life. There was absolutely nothing left for him to say. The heavy steel cage had firmly and permanently slammed shut. Your ultimate fatal mistake was believing I was just a soft, foolish old man, desperately looking for basic affection. I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, freezing whisper. You viewed my innocent son as nothing more than a convenient biological anchor, a living prop you actively intended to brutally use to secure total, unquestionable control over my entire estate after you successfully murdered me. You spent 10 long, incredibly patient years meticulously building an absolute masterpiece of sheer deceit. But you severely underestimated the dangerous man you were trying to kill. I did not build my massive empire by gently allowing toxic parasites to feed on my life. I built it by destroying them. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his tactical belt. He calmly informed them that their entire international financial network had been permanently seized by the United States government exactly 2 hours ago. Every single offshore account was frozen. Every stolen dollar was securely confiscated, and their massive corporate theft was completely over. They were absolutely bankrupt, entirely destitute, and facing decades in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, massive wire fraud, and international money laundering. Preston finally broke. He dropped to the floor beside his weeping wife, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic whimper that echoed pitifully through the grand study. Valerie reached out toward me, her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of absolute unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to beg for mercy, but the federal agent firmly grabbed her arms violently, twisting them behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I sat in my leather chair, silently smoking my cigar, watching with cold satisfaction as the heavily armed agents aggressively dragged the 2 sobbing criminals out of my study. They pulled them down the grand marble staircase and marched them directly out the front door into the freezing morning air. They were shoved roughly into a waiting armored vehicle, entirely stripped of their stolen dignity and their pathetic delusions. I listened as the heavy doors slammed shut and the loud sirens began to wail, fading slowly into the distance. The suffocating poison had been completely extracted from my home. I successfully defended my life, my vast legacy, and my innocent son. The empire was entirely mine again, and the monsters were gone forever. Exactly 2 years have passed since that freezing morning, when the heavy doors of the armored vehicle slammed shut on my fabricated life. I am sitting quietly on the wide wooden porch of my isolated ranch in Wyoming, breathing in the crisp, incredibly pure mountain air. The endless, towering pine trees sway gently in the afternoon breeze, casting long, peaceful shadows across the sprawling green valley. This is the exact sanctuary where my beloved son Toby was safely hidden, while I meticulously dismantled the vicious predators who sought to destroy us both. Today he is happily running across the expansive lawn, his bright laughter echoing clearly against the distant snow-capped peaks. He is safe, deeply loved, and entirely free from the toxic, suffocating influence of the two monsters who viewed his very existence as nothing more than a biological key to a stolen fortune. Warren had proven to be an exceptionally loyal ally throughout the entire exhausting ordeal, successfully guiding the highly complex federal prosecutions directly toward their inevitable, crushing conclusions. He visits us occasionally, happily trading his heavy leather briefcase for a simple fishing rod and a quiet afternoon by the pristine river. The massive, sprawling logistics empire that consumed the vast majority of my adult life no longer exists. Shortly after the spectacular, highly publicized arrests of Julian and Elena, I made the deliberate, completely irreversible decision to entirely liquidate the toxic company. I methodically sold off every single division, every commercial warehouse, and every lucrative international contract to my fiercest competitors. The corporate board was completely dissolved, the towering headquarters was permanently vacated, and the massive $80 million fortune was safely consolidated into a series of impenetrable, highly regulated trusts strictly dedicated to Toby and his secure future. I simply had absolutely no desire to return to the cold, cutthroat executive boardroom that had so easily nurtured such profound, unadulterated evil. I chose to completely walk away from the glittering, high-rise penthouses and the superficial, wealthy society that had blindly celebrated my fraudulent marriage. The relentless wheels of federal justice moved with a crushing, methodical efficiency. The overwhelming mountain of forensic financial evidence we willingly handed to the government proved completely insurmountable for their desperate defense attorneys. Confronted with undeniable proof of their forged identities, massive corporate embezzlement, and the terrifying lethal chemical trap found in my basement, they had absolutely no viable legal recourse. Last month, a federal judge officially sentenced both Preston Gallagher and Elena Rostova to 30 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. They will spend the rest of their natural lives locked inside a miserable steel cage, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their arrogant delusions. They will grow old and fade away in absolute disgrace, entirely forgotten by the bustling world they tried to conquer. Every single stolen asset was thoroughly tracked down, permanently seized, and immediately returned. The sheer magnitude of their incredible failure will forever serve as a terrifying warning to anyone who foolishly attempts to prey upon a seemingly vulnerable target. They gambled their entire future on a single arrogant assumption, and they lost absolutely everything they had. I watched Toby throw a red ball for our newly adopted golden retriever, feeling a profound, settling peace finally wash over my weary soul. The terrifying storm that violently threatened to consume our entire universe has completely passed. The suffocating phantom of my 10-year fake life has been entirely eradicated, replaced by the genuine, undeniable warmth of a quiet, honest existence. I am no longer the blind, vulnerable old man they so eagerly targeted, nor am I the ruthless, bloodthirsty tycoon who aggressively orchestrated their spectacular ruin. I am simply a devoted father, fiercely protecting his son, living peacefully under the vast, open Wyoming sky. The long, dark night is finally over, and the warm morning sun shines incredibly bright. At 70 years old, I learned the most brutal truth of my life. Blood and time do not guarantee loyalty. Evil does not always wear a mask of hatred. Sometimes it wears the smile of a loving wife and the dedication of a trusted protege. You can spend a decade building a life only to realize you have been constructing your own tomb. But age brings a quiet, lethal clarity. Never ignore your instincts, never dismiss the innocent warnings of a child, and never forget that the man who built the empire knows how to burn it to the ground. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be living a double life? Drop your experiences in the comments below. See you in the next great story.